Hi, everybody. Welcome to Read Science in conjunction with Scientific American. My name is Joanne Manaster, and I am a blogger with Scientific American. And along with my co-host, Jeff Shaumeyer, we like to take a little bit of time out every once in a while to speak with a science author. They can write books or blogs or do something for TV. And today we are very fortunate to have our guest, David Quammen, who is an author and journalist who has written, I read 15 books, but I guess 12 of them are nonfiction. They include Song of the Dodo, The Reluctant Mr. Darwin, and most recently, Spillover, which is a work on science, history, and human impacts of emerging diseases, particularly the viral diseases. It has been recognized on 7 national and international awards lists, and he has also published a few hundred pieces of short nonfiction, feature articles, essays, and columns in all the places we are used to seeing our great science writers, which include Harper's, National Geographic, Outside, Esquire, The Atlantic, Rolling Stone. So he occasionally writes op-eds for the New York Times and reviews books for the New York Times as well. He has been honored with an Academy Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, is a 3-time recipient of the National Magazine Award. He is a contributing writer for National Geographic, and in whose service he travels often, usually to wild and remote places. He is currently in Bozeman, Montana. Right now, if you watch the Weather Channel at all, and you might be catching his video series based on the book Spillover called The Virus Hunters, and it's based on stories from the book. So welcome, David.
Thank you, Joanne. Very good to be with you. Hi, Jeff. Nice to be part of this.
It's a real pleasure to be talking with you, David. I hope it doesn't make you feel old or something, but I won't say I was reading your books when I was 3 years old, but I checked the list to make sure, and I have read all of your books. I have enjoyed all of your books. I'm just starting Spillover, so that's my latest one to enjoy. And I'll have a little story, if Joanne reminds me later, to tell about a personal connection.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
But since we're going to be talking some about this book, Spillover, and about the video series on the Weather Channel, which is called The Virus Hunters, I want to throw you the easy ball and say, let's start by talking about this idea of spillover, what it is, what zoonotic is, a new word for everyone to learn, and why it's important so that we have some context for these things that we're going to discuss that are interesting and attention-worthy.
Sure. Yeah, that's sort of the ABCs of this whole subject. The book is about zoonotic diseases. Very simply defined as zoonosis is an animal infection that's transmissible to humans. That could mean a virus or a bacterium or a fungus or a prion or a worm, or what else does that leave? A protozoan, a protist, all the things that infect humans and other animals. So zoonosis is an animal infection transmissible to humans, and if it causes symptoms, if it causes problems once that virus or whatever it is transmitted, then we call that a zoonotic disease. And I think the figure is roughly 60%, according to different counts, of the infectious diseases known among humans are zoonotic diseases in the strict and sort of immediate sense. Over the longer term, you could argue that all infectious diseases of humans are ultimately zoonotic because we're a relatively young species, and even our old diseases had to come from somewhere else originally. So the book is all about the spillover, hence the title, the spillover of infectious agents from non-human animals into humans, causing, in some cases, dramatic disease, gruesome pandemics, and in the current years, seemingly causing an increasing drumbeat of new emerging diseases.
You had a long list that I haven't memorized, but all of the things that have been in the news lately, like SARS and Ebola and HIV, and a much longer list of that, all of these are zoonotic.
That's right, yeah. The influenzas are all zoonotic. All of the influenzas emerge ultimately from wild aquatic birds. There are things, little-known things, but with names like Nipah virus and Hendra virus disease that come out of animals and get into humans and cause death on a small scale, but on a very dramatic ways. You mentioned Ebola, SARS, MERS out of Saudi Arabia, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome virus is also a zoonosis. So virtually all of the scary new diseases that we hear about, that we read about in the headlines, are zoonotic diseases, because the fact that they're new means that they have come from somewhere else and gotten into humans, and they turn out to be really destructive agents once they're in humans, and in some cases not just very destructive, but also very dangerously transmissible.
Right. So Ebola, of course, is one that is really well known for being very transmissible and very devastating, but it's short-lived. It burns itself out. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
That's right. Ebola has a strange reputation. It's a very strange, dramatic, gruesome disease, Ebola virus disease, but it's not as preternatural, quite as gruesome, quite as bloody as the public has been led to believe by some of the books that came out, 10 and 20 years ago. The Hot Zone was a riveting book when it came out about 20 years ago. I read it. A lot of other people read it, and in some cases it was the first thing that anyone learned about Ebola virus. I've been back and forth a little bit with Richard Preston on this. I don't want to beat up on him, but I think even he admits now that that there was a bit of exaggeration, a bit of, I won't call it poetic license, but it was portrayed as an almost preternatural virus that caused horrific bleeding in virtually every case. People were bleeding out. People were melting down from this virus. Well, the experts have told me that that's really not the case with Ebola. It is a horrible disease. It kills between 60 and 90% of the people it infects, depending on the species of Ebola virus and depending on the circumstances. So it's a terrible disease, but it's not preternatural. It causes organ shutdown. It causes something called disseminated intravascular coagulation, which is a blood symptom that can, in some cases, lead to unusual bleeding, but doesn't necessarily in most of the cases. It causes a lot of vomiting and diarrhea, and it causes people to die for those reasons. But it's not very transmissible from human to human. As you said, Joanne, it burns out. It burns so hot, it kills people so quickly, makes them very sick so quickly, and kills them if it's going to kill them so quickly, that it doesn't spread as well as some others. Also, it's not an airborne virus. It's not transmissible on a sneeze or a cough the way the influenzas and some of the coronaviruses are. So Ebola virus is the most infamous of all these things, and it's a terrible disease if you're an African villager, but it's not the highest on the list of global threats.
So what would be highest on the list of global threats? I'm going to guess it's a flu, but...
Well, a flu would be in that group, yeah. Near the end of my research for Spillover, I asked some of the experts that I've been talking to over the years, what do you think the next big one will look like? What should we be watching for? And they said, well, it certainly will be, there will be a next big one. It's inevitable that there will be another large pandemic, whether it kills tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of people, depends on circumstances and how we respond, but something like that will come along. It will almost certainly be a zoonotic agent. It'll come out of non-human animals. It'll almost certainly be a virus. It'll probably be a single-stranded RNA virus, because they replicate less reliably. They mutate. They have high rates of mutation, so they're very changeable. The the single-stranded RNA viruses, very changeable and therefore very adaptable. And then you look down that list of single-stranded RNA viruses of zoonotic origin, and the experts say, well, okay, that brings us to the influenzas, the coronaviruses, the paramyxoviruses. So things like SARS represent good, scary paradigms for what the next big one might look like. SARS or the influenzas or some other sort of coronavirus, and that's the reason people have taken MERS so seriously, this new virus out of Saudi Arabia, because it falls in that small group that rank highest on the watch list of the possible next really big bad one.
Types of viruses. So has now, of course, comment sections are really hard to gather, but has the Middle East been dealing with this appropriately? Because now we do have our first case. Someone who traveled to Saudi Arabia has ended up in Indiana.
That's right.
Been diagnosed with MERS, and my understanding is that at this point, human-to-human transmission seems low, and they're seeing a lot of the cases where maybe they consume camel milk or camel meat, or they're sort of implicating camels, but maybe bats to camels. Bats seem to be a big reservoir. But yeah, if you could expand a little bit on MERS and and the Middle East.
Right. Well, as of this morning, or as of a message that I got yesterday, MERS now stands at 411 cases with 112 deaths. So that's a case fatality rate.
35% or so.
I think it's about 27%.
27.
So that's high, but it's not anywhere near as high as Ebola. It's higher actually, though, than SARS was. SARS case fatality rate was around 10%, if I recall correctly. Something like 8,000 people infected around the world with 800 fatalities. So this has got a higher case fatality rate than SARS, but it's not nearly as transmissible human to human as SARS. I gather there does seem to be some at least suspected human-to-human transmission. I think as of the report yesterday, I think there were 15 new cases, and of the 15 new cases, 7 of those were among personal contacts of people who had already been confirmed as having this.
Like hospital workers or family.
Yeah. So the secondary cases, seemingly secondary cases, but I don't think that's been proven that they are secondary cases, because there's always a possibility that these secondary cases could have shared situations with the primary case, and they might have been exposed directly to the reservoir host or the amplifier host of the virus rather than getting it from humans. So I'm tossing these terms around: reservoir host and amplifier host. The reservoir host is the species of creature, or maybe in some cases several species of creatures, in which the virus or the other pathogen lives endemically, permanently, inconspicuously, without causing symptoms. That's its permanent residence. If it's something that kills humans as soon as it gets into us, then it has to live somewhere else over the longer term to survive. That's the reservoir host. An amplifier host is an animal or a species of animal that serves as an intermediary. So in the case of, for instance, Hendra virus in Australia, it's known that the virus resides in fruit bats, 3 species of fruit bats. It spills out of fruit bats and gets into horses, and then it really rampages through horses. It causes horrible symptoms, fast death, high viral loads, a lot of viral shedding in horses, and then it gets into the people who take care of horses, veterinarians and horse trainers and people. That's been the pattern in Hendra virus. Now with MERS in Saudi Arabia, I think there is some suspicion that the virus might have its reservoir host in bats, but that it has a presence in camels as an amplifier host, and that humans are perhaps getting it from camels and not directly from bats, but the camels may be getting it from bats. But there's new work that's just been published in about the last week online by a group of whom the senior author is Ian Lipkin at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia, who is a brilliant laboratory researcher on these emerging viruses. And Ian Lipkin and his group, if I recall correctly, found that based on molecular phylogenetics, this virus has been circulating in camels since about 1992. Mm-hmm. There's enough divergence among the different strains found in camels of Saudi Arabia, possibly also Egypt, to suggest that it's not just spilling over day by day from bats into camels and then from camels into people, but it's perhaps circulating as a new infection, but an infection that has become endemic in camels. As I say, I don't hold me to every detail of what I've just said, but that's what I recall seeing in this new report that I just saw online a few days ago.
So this brings a couple questions. One is from someone who is asking a question here from our audience. They said, many of the zoonotic diseases examined in Spillover name bats as reservoir hosts. Mm-hmm. What impact does bat habitat destruction have in this puzzle? And that is one thing, if you read the book, you will leave going, hi, I think I should be afraid of bats.
Well, I hope I didn't add to the undeserved bad reputation that bats have. They have enough PR problems. And I did not want to demonize bats. I wanted to describe the situation. So
I thought it was realistic, though. I didn't feel like there was any overt attempt at demonization. But they just kept coming up again and again.
But yes, there is a strong pattern that in many cases, these new zoonotic diseases have been found to have their reservoir host in one species or other, or several of bats. So that scientists started asking, why bats? Why do they seem to be disproportionately implicated as reservoir hosts? And there are a couple possible explanations for that. One is that bats are a very, very diverse group of animals. There are lots of species of bat. I think it's 1 in every 4 species of mammal on planet Earth is a species of bat. So they are disproportionately represented in the diversity of mammal species. They also, many of them live long lifetimes. They live to be 18 or 20 years old. They're very social. They live in huge aggregations. So you put those things together, long lifespans and massive colonies at very, very close proximity to one another, and you have potentially very good circumstances for incubating viruses, for allowing viruses to live and persist in a population of animals.
And they travel widely too, right?
And they travel widely. They move around, and not just in 2 dimensions, but in 3 dimensions. Mm-hmm. They occupy a big volume of space. So all of those things combine to create this pattern wherein a large number of these new diseases are found to have their reservoir hosts in bats. And that's SARS, which is a coronavirus, belongs to the coronavirus family, was found in several species of bat in southern China. Mm-hmm. And because of that, bats were high on the list of hypothetical reservoirs for MERS, because it also is a coronavirus, not too closely related to SARS, but within the same family anyway. So some of the people I write about in my book were involved in doing field work in Saudi Arabia, testing bats, sampling bats, looking for evidence of this new MERS coronavirus, and they found some. They found that there was evidence of the virus in bats, but they didn't find such a prevalence in bats and such a high level of virus as to answer the question definitively that. Where this virus has its reservoir host. But the original question was about habitat destruction. Let me loop back to that before I chatter on too much more about bats. The questioner is absolutely right that habitat destruction causes bats to move closer to humans, at least in some cases. This is true in Australia, where the great inland eucalyptus forests have in broad areas been cut down, been chained down, been clear cut for agriculture and for human development of various different sorts, and those eucalyptus forests were habitat for some of the fruit bats that carry Hendra virus, among others, and those fruit bats are now coming into the city of Sydney, to the botanical gardens, to the parks in Sydney. They're coming into orchards along the eastern coast of Australia, up into subtropical Australia. They're coming closer to humans, and that may be the reason that suddenly this new virus, known as Hendra, started getting into horses and then humans back in 1994. In Malaysia, likewise, the destruction of Malaysian tropical forests seems to have pushed some species of bats closer to human orchards, places where humans are growing fruit trees on which the bats can feed. These are big tropical fruit-eating bats. They actually eat fruit, in some cases blossoms and nectar, and so they go looking for those things. And if people have planted orchards, then those will attract bats when the bats are driven out of their natural habitat. And if the orchards happen to be planted on pig farms, around pigsties, even overhanging pigsties, as was the case in northern Malaysia, then that represents a great opportunity for virus to spill over from these bats down into the pig pens and get into the pigs. This happened with Nipah virus, causing an outbreak of this disease in pigs, and then it passed from pigs into pig farmers, pig butchers, pork handlers, and ended up killing more than 100 people in the pork industry in Malaysia.
Well, habitat destruction is a big part of your answer, right, to the question of why do we seem to be seeing so many of these zoonotic outbreaks in the last few decades? Is that a real phenomenon, or are we imagining it? And it seems that it's real, and that there are several reasons, and that's one of them, yeah?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. Habitat destruction, the fact that we're pushing into the highly diverse ecosystems where lots of different kinds of species, including lots of different kinds of viruses, live. You know, we're building roads and timber camps and mines and settlements in the Central African forests, in the forests of Southeast Asia, in the forests of South America, and we're disrupting ecosystems. We're destroying habitat. We're killing and eating the native animals, and in some cases we're capturing them and shipping them to live animal markets in other countries. We're doing all these sorts of things that are disruptive of native species, and that bring us into close contact with native species of animal and plant. But I think we're talking mostly about animals, and those animals, those different kinds of animals, carry different kinds of viruses. So we offer opportunity to those viruses to change hosts, to spill over, to leap from one species of animal into this other species that happens to be humans, and that turns out to be, as I've said in the book, it turns out to be a great career move if you're a virus and you infect some sort of an endangered species of primate in Central Africa, and you manage to jump from that endangered species of primate into this other kind of primate, of which it turns out there are 7 billion individuals, all moving around the planet, closely interacting with one another. Then you've just made a great career move, and that's what the HIV-1 virus did.
Right. If Joanne will let me, there's some lurking science communication issues that I wanted to.
Although quickly, since he ended with AIDS, it looks like your last chapter of your book is going to be turned into its own standalone book, right? We want to make sure our watchers here are aware of that. So
thank you, Joanne. Yeah, actually, the second last chapter of my book, I think of it as the crescendo of Spillover. It's a long, about 110-page chapter on the ecological origins of the AIDS pandemic, how a chimpanzee virus spilled over from a single chimp into a single human back around 1908, give or take a margin of error, in the southeastern corner of Cameroon. We know this all now from good molecular work, and spread across the world in what we now know as the AIDS pandemic. So I tell the story of these new scientific findings, work done by some wonderful scientists, Michael Warraby in Tucson, Beatrice Hahn at the University of Pennsylvania, and a lot of their colleagues that have developed this new and radically unexpected story of the origins of AIDS. So I tell that whole story in my my penultimate chapter, which is titled "The Chimp and the River." And my publisher, W.W. Norton, has decided that they want to, in addition to publishing a paperback edition of Spillover, in the coming, I think this winter, they will publish The Chimp and the River as a small freestanding paperback book itself with a new introduction by me.
I think that's a great move because, you know, some people will be intimidated by a book of this size. So I think just having the AIDS, and so many people have questions about AIDS.
Well, good. Well, I hope you're right. That we think that makes sense too. That you know, it is Spillover is a long book. I like to think of it as a concise long book, but it is still
excellent.
A long book. And the AIDS story is very important. And very counterintuitive, very different from what most people think they know about the history of AIDS. So it seemed like a good idea to put it out as a freestanding book.
We'll be sure to promote it.
Yeah, and that is big. So there are lots of things. We were talking about Ebola and how it may have been over sensationalized, and there are several issues at hand. I think about how to get precise and accurate information to people who need to know about it and maybe not interested. And I thought one starting place is this story when I was reading the first chapter about Hendra virus and how it had moved to some humans through horses and that whole thing. And you were talking to a racehorse trainer. I pictured it in a bar or something, and a little bit of what he has to say. He gives you his perspective on the Hendra virus. He says they shouldn't allow it. They should get rid of those bats. Those bats cause the disease. They hang upside down and they shit on themselves. And then they shit on people. It's backwards. Let the people shit on them. Yeah. But those sentimental greenies won't allow it. I thought, boy, is there so much mixed up in his head. But how do you break through? You know, there are several ways to approach this, but how do you break through those attitudes? How do you get in there? How do you do some instruction, some useful learning and understanding without being sensational or misguided? Everyone has to make a choice. I think, you know, one choice is sort of to be calm and very thorough, and some people will see it and you can use the materials, and that's sort of the way I'm thinking of Spillover. And your you know, your long conciseness is you always approach things with a thoroughness that's not boring, but is very important to have. And I think that is one way to keep people calm, at least the ones who hear the message, and not everyone's going to get the same message. Is that a choice? How do you decide these things? How do you avoid sensationalism, or should you?
Well, yes, I think you should. I mean, this is potentially a very sensational subject. Maybe even objectively, you could say it is. I mean, a lot of people die in this book.
Yeah.
There's a lot of gruesome misery, and it's important, I think, to convey that because these viruses, many of them are very, very dangerous, and the subject is important. So it's dramatic, and I wanted to make it dramatic so that people would pay attention to this. But I did not want to make it melodramatic. I did not want to exaggerate. You don't need to exaggerate these things in order for them to be, you know, arrestingly scary. So I stayed very close, tried to stay very close to accurate and precise scientific information as it was presented in the journal literature. When I write a book, I travel a lot. I talk to a lot of scientists. I try and spend time in the field with field scientists, but I also read huge piles of journal articles. I read a lot of journal articles, and so that's where some of the information, a lot of the information, comes from, the hard facts. And if they've appeared in peer-reviewed journal articles, then you can presumably rely on them. So that's where I get a lot of my hard facts about, for instance, Hendra virus or Ebola virus. When I report from the field, I I hold myself to a very strict standard of accuracy in terms, for instance, of quotes.
Mm-hmm.
If I don't get a quote verbatim, either in my notebook because I'm scribbling fast or on my recorder because I'm taping, then I don't assemble my best recollection of what somebody said and then put it in quotation marks later on. For instance, you mentioned that racehorse trainer. We were in a bar. We were at a race course. We were in the members' lounge of a race course in Australia, and I had been brought in there by my veterinarian friend who dealt with this disease, a wonderful fellow named Peter Reed. And so he took me to the races one day and took me, into the members' lounge, and I met the owners and trainers along the stables in the back. So I was behind the scenes, and I was his guest. And then he introduced me to this famous Australian race trainer who had won all the big races in Australia, and his name was Bart Cummings, and he was quite a character. But yeah, we were standing there with beers in our hands, and he hears that I'm a writer following the thread of the story of Hendra virus, and he starts to give me an earful, saying, they should kill all the bats, etc., etc. Well, I'm certainly not taping him, and I'm really not in a situation to be scribbling in my notebook. It would have seemed a little peculiar and rude. So I think I did scribble a few notes, but I did not get his tirade verbatim. And if you look back at that passage in the book, unless I'm hugely mistaken, there are no quotation marks around what he says.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm essentially paraphrasing him. Maybe I put it in italics, or I do something to indicate that this is the essence of what this guy said, but I'm not claiming that this is a verbatim quote.
Oh, sure.
So,
sure, and it certainly gave the flavor. And now, at the communication issue, some people might try to directly go at some of his misconceptions. There's an awful lot. It's like he's got some of the truth in there. We learned about the bats and things. He knows bats are involved, but it's because he's come up with this idea that bats hang upside down, so they shit on themselves, and somehow that causes the disease. It's like, what do you do? I think what you do, which I quite like, is not try to take all of those misconceptions apart, but to tell the coherent story sort of calmly from the beginning, and try not to be distracted by that.
Well, good. That's what I do, and I'm glad that it seems like a good tactic to you, Jeff.
Yeah.
I mean, there are a couple of places where it would have been possible to stop and give readers a lecture on how important bats are, and they're beneficial to our ecosystems, and they deserve to live, and we shouldn't demonize them, and they pollinate plants, and they eat a lot of insects and things. And I mean, I've written a lot of that kind of thing in other books and in other places, and it just seemed to me, maybe I'm mistaken in this, but it just seemed to me so obvious that those things to a reasonably intelligent reader that I didn't want to bring the narrative and the science explication to a halt in order to give that particular ecological lecture. So I didn't, and I let the facts speak for themselves.
I would say it's a good choice. Not everyone, and not to entirely change the subject, Joanne, but what you can do in telling those stories in, say, 500 pages of Spillover is an awful lot different from what you can do in a 5-minute video on the Weather Channel, right?
That's right.
We have both of these, and they are very different ways of telling the stories. And I think the book appeals to me more, but I can see a lot of value in the videos. But do you have anything you want to say about what you give up by having to work within those 5 minutes?
Well, sure, yes. I mean, this series of short video, Virus Hunters, is now up, as you said, on weather.com. It's produced by some very good filmmakers at the Weather Channel, and they came to me, I guess last fall, through my agent, and said, we would like to make a series of short films about what you write about in the book, about some of the facts and ideas and characters of Spillover. And they said these, and when we say short films, we mean short.
Yeah.
This is what is happening now with media. Very short but well-produced, dramatic films for streaming on the web, 4, 5, 6 minutes long. We want to do 6 of these, 6 episodes. So if so I saw some of their other work, and it was good, and it was responsible, and it was careful, and it was also dramatic and effective. I saw a couple of episodes that they had made about conservation biologists and field biologists that I know, and I thought that they did a very good job of capturing some important things in that little cameo form. So I said, yes, let's do this. And I was involved with them in terms of developing contacts and helping them with ideas and ground truthing some of their early versions and helping them correct things that needed to be corrected. And I think I'm listed as an executive producer on that basis. But I didn't write the scripts. They wrote the scripts.
Right.
I helped correct those. And so, yes, you give up a lot to reach a particular different kind of audience in a different way. If I were to start from scratch and say, well, I want to produce a television series based on Spillover, I would not say, and I want each episode to be 6 minutes long. But that was an opportunity of a particular sort presented to me, so I said, well, let's explore this and see if we can do it in a way that's useful and doesn't trivialize these diseases or these people or these topics. And if we can do that, then I'm happy to proceed. And they showed me that they could do that. You give up an awful lot, but the little slices that you get, I think have a particular value in the form that they're in.
Right. Well, I thought they were fantastic. Would it be okay if we go to some of our viewer questions?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. So we've got one here saying, do you think vaccinating primates against diseases like Ebola could help prevent outbreaks?
Well, vaccinating wild animals is always tough. It's just difficult logistically. But it's not a crazy idea. It has been considered, and work has been done toward developing a vaccine against Ebola that could somehow be given to gorillas and chimps in Central Africa. Because, when we haven't talked about this, but it's in the book, Ebola turns out to be devastating, not just to humans, but also to gorillas and chimps. And there are some people who believe that Ebola has been spreading through gorilla populations of Central Africa, killing thousands or tens of thousands of gorillas over recent decades. There are areas of wonderful gorilla habitat in Central Africa, for instance, in Gabon, these areas of wonderful gorilla habitat that are empty of gorillas. And I walked through one of those areas for 10 days on a National Geographic assignment some years ago with a fellow who was censusing wildlife, looking for gorillas among other things. And in 10 days of walking, we found hundreds and hundreds of sign of forest elephant and a lot of other creatures that were alive and well in that forest, and zero sign of gorilla. What was the reason? Well, the probable reason is that Ebola had killed those gorillas. Difficult to prove, but strong inferential hypothesis. So some of the wildlife conservation people, including some very good veterinarians, have been researching the possibility of using some sort of baiting system, putting out food that contains an Ebola vaccine to try and stop the spread, the chain of transmission of this disease, and in gorilla populations and the devastation that it causes. So, as I say, it's difficult to do. Difficult to vaccinate wild animals. How do you get to every one of them? How do you get to enough of them? You don't go running through the forest tranquilizing gorillas and giving them injections. You have to do something that is more effective than that. And so people are thinking about it. People are working on it.
So that's actually a really good answer. So here's something interesting. This comes to probably human affecting our environment. This is actually about global warming, which there are whole books written about how global warming is affecting our health. But this one is interesting. With global warming being all too evident and the glaciers and ice caps melting, what is the probability that an ancient virus or bacteria that has been frozen, thawing out, and being reintroduced into the world? This is not exactly zoonosis, but
yeah.
You become an accidental expert by writing a book.
Right. A virus frozen in glaciers. Well, viruses only survive in living cells. So if an animal is frozen for 10,000 years, is it possible for a virus in that animal to be reactivated? I suppose that it is. And if I'm wrong, I'm sure people will correct me immediately on that.
Yes.
But that's my off the top of the head recollection response, that it might be possible.
Yeah, I had not heard this before, so.
Yeah. I mean, you know, we know you can get ancient DNA out of a creature, even a human being that's been frozen for 10,000 years. It might be possible to wake up a virus that's frozen in the cells of such a creature. Whether that's something worth worrying about is a different question.
Yes.
I mean, there are a lot of reasons to be concerned about climate change, global warming. I wouldn't put that near the top of the list because there are so many other viruses that aren't frozen that we are coming in contact with. I mean, some people estimate that every species of plant, animal, fungus, bacterium on the planet probably is a unique host of at least one virus, maybe 10 viruses. These are very, very rough ballpark guesses. So that you don't need to go to a mammoth thawing out of the ice in northern Canada that might be carrying a new virus in order to be exposed to a new virus. All you have to do is walk across Central Africa and turn over a couple of rocks and eat a fish and touch a turtle and be shat upon by a bat to be exposed to new viruses.
Right, or eat the fruit a bat has.
Or pick up a piece of fruit. Yeah, that a bat has licked.
Right.
So our mothers were right. Don't touch that turtle. You never know where it's been.
That's right. And
and then vectors like mosquitoes, their habitat's increasing with warmer climates, so that a vector-borne disease is not necessarily zoonotic, but you did address that as far as malaria, like how it may have originated in a different animal. It didn't just evolve.
Right. And that's what I think of when I think of the potential impacts of climate change in terms of infectious disease and in general and zoonotic disease in particular. I mean, now don't we have West Nile fever in all of the 48 contiguous states? I think we do. And what's the reason for that? Well, one of the reasons for that is that there are mosquitoes that are vectors for West Nile virus that are surviving through the winters in places where they did not used to survive through the winters.
Right. Yeah, it's amazing. This last question, we'll ask one more question here from our readers. This one you can modify to answer the way that seems fit. So he's asking, what are the top 2 mistakes that humanity has made by and large, historically speaking, when it's been hit by a pandemic? So I suppose you could answer just one. I don't know if I could come up with
this. I remember this. This is from Hugo, right?
Yes.
Interesting question, Hugo. Well, the mistakes that we make have changed over time. For instance, in the late 19th century in America, when people came down with smallpox, we would put them in pest houses. And in particular, if they were poor and came from tenements and slums, we would drag them out of those tenements and slums. Officials would, city or state officials, and would confine those people in pest houses. And these pest houses then became wonderful places of transmission. If you were a suspected case, but not confirmed, and you were confined in a pest house, the chances are that you would become a confirmed case very quickly. That sort of response, that the idea that infectious diseases were endemic to poor people, was a horrible mistake, but it was a common mistake. You know, the idea that poor people, because they, you know, their hygiene standards were not high enough, that they were particularly susceptible to these diseases, and therefore the way to deal with these diseases was some sort of public health apartheid. That was a horrible mistake that was made, with severe consequences in this country and a number of other places. In terms of mistakes that we're making now, well, one potential mistake is related to that. It's the notion that the way to deal with these diseases is to confine people, to shut down movement, to treat the disease as a form of guilt. You know, we saw that in the early stages of the AIDS pandemic in the U.S. That also occurred in Cuba, where people who were HIV positive, I believe, were, well, I don't want to say more than I actually know, but I think that there was in Cuba there were some harsh measures about toward people who are HIV positive in terms of segregating them from the general population. With Ebola, currently there's this outbreak in Guinea, and they are trying to stop it, but I noticed that the World Health Organization has not recommended restrictions on travel in Guinea. Why is that? Well, the way it's explained is that if they invoke restrictions on travel and forced confinement of possible cases, then you're going to drive the disease underground, and people are going to be afraid to go to clinics if they think they might have the disease, because they'll be treated as guilty, they'll be treated as prisoners. So generally, I guess what I'm saying is one of the worst mistakes that we've made is the confusion of being infected with being guilty of something, and the forms of social segregation and constraint that followed after that, and we've mostly gotten past that, but it's something that we still have to be very careful about.
This was something that we've sort of talked about, but I made a note this, and you were talking about how these outbreaks of these various zoonotic incidents might be seen as independent, disconnected, perhaps judgmental things sent to to point out various groups of people as causing this or that, and in fact that they are related, that there is a pattern, there are things we can understand, and it's a natural event, and it can be pretty hard to keep our prejudices, even for scientists, out of understanding what's going on, right?
That's right. That's right. We can demonize the victims. We can demonize the reservoir hosts. We can demonize anybody associated with these things, and that does not lead us either to better understanding or to better response to these things. I think the way I put it in the book is that there's a tendency of for the public to think that this drumbeat of new diseases, Ebola and Machupo and Hendra and Nipah and SARS and bird flu and MERS and a number of others, that this drumbeat of diseases represent things that are happening to us, independent forms of misfortune that are happening to us. And the point that I try to bring out in the book is that these are not merely things that are happening to us. These are reflections of things that we're doing. They are part of an interconnected pattern that relates to our activities, how we live together, and how we live with other species on this planet.
Yeah, and that things are different when that's the habitat destruction, and how we can do all of these things when there are only, say, 500 million people on the Earth versus when there are 7 billion people on the Earth.
That's right, yeah. Some of this is, the scientists would call these density-dependent effects. I mean, the fact that that if somebody gets sick from eating a wild animal at a restaurant in southern China, and that person picks up a virus, and that person goes to a wedding in Hong Kong and stays in a hotel and coughs or sneezes in the elevator, some woman from Toronto can walk into that elevator, pick up that virus, and that virus will travel around the world in about 14 hours.
Mm-hmm.
That's a new situation.
It is. That's sort of the plot for Contagion. So I'm looking like we are at the end of our show, and it's been wonderful to talk with you, David. And I really hope our audience here, if you have not picked up Spillover and you're up for a nice book, I mean, it got technical depth, it's an engaging story because you have personalities. It's not just a review paper on every type of, a zoonotic disease. I mean, it's really an engaging story.
It's full of detective stories, I like to say.
It is like a detective story. And this is great, which makes, the 500 pages just go by fast. It is one of the ones that's hard to put down, which is always helpful when it's a big book. And I really enjoyed it. I also listened to it on audio. I would switch back between the book and audio, and you had a great narrator for this too. So, is there anything else you would like to add that maybe we forgot to ask you, David, before we sign off?
Be safe, travel well, stay healthy, and don't eat the monkeys.
Yes, we have one last story. Jeff has a website called Scienticity, and his website has a mascot, and it's related to you, David, and a story.
Really?
Yeah, the Scienticity mascot is an American crow, and the reason that we thought the crow was an entirely suitable animal was largely inspired by your article from long ago called something like "Are Crows a Product, their own success?" or "Has Success Spoiled the Crow?" That was
Success Spoiled the Crow, yeah.
In which
I remember that.
Yeah, in which you describe many of the antics and things they get up to. Basically, you posited because they're bored. And
that's right. Yeah.
I found very appealing that idea that crows are just out to learn new things and have new experiences. And I'll say about Spillover that I enjoy reading it at that rate, and I think it exposes. It proceeds in a way that parallels the way science works and unfolds, and that's something that I always look for as a mark of a good science book. So congratulations on that.
Well, thank you both very much. Thank you. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you. I've enjoyed this, and I appreciate the interest in the book and the ideas.
Great. Well, thank you, David, so much, and thank you, Jeff, as always. It's a pleasure to sit here with you. And thank you to everybody who watched and turned in questions, and we will see you again next time on Read Science.